So I put together this graphic. And, as I'm putting this together, I'm recognizing that this is kind of a model, and in this model, we're saying, well, let's consider two dimensions in the economy. The vertical dimension is heavy government regulation versus limited government regulation, and people have different points of view about that particular difference. And then we can look at the ownership of production. Private ownership of production versus public ownership production is another spectrum that we can consider. And let's just talk about some terms and kind of how they apply. Now, this circular area here sort of corresponds to this oval area, sort of corresponds to the full range of different popular opinions that are out there, let's say in the US economy today, or in the US society. And if you want to move to sort of the radical left, the very far left, we're in the direction of a much more public ownership of production, control of important industries, for example, and this was very true in, say, Britain in the 1960s even, where Britain owned the steel firms, the government owned the coal plants. There was much more public ownership of what is now private industries in most countries. And that was a much more sort of radical left position at that particular time. The far right over here is associated with concepts of laissez faire, just leave everything alone, let the government or let individuals and businesses do whatever they want, or libertarianism, which is kind of on the economic front, a free market approach, but also libertarian is very liberal on the social front. I'm not going to get into that particular distinction. You can learn more about that a little bit later. Now, I want to highlight the fact that the United States has kind of moved. The 1820s, go back, early part of our history, was much, much less government regulation. We had private ownership of production, but there was very limited federal government regulation, especially back in the 1820s. And what has changed between then and now is that there's been a whole lot more intervention by government. And a lot of that really took place during the New Deal, because of the Great Depression and the decline of the American economy at that time. There was a lot of insistence to try to solve the problem and fix the problem with government. And there was a big changeover in attitude towards government that took place in the 1930s and that prevails today. Now, I would argue, and I'm going to come back and talk about why Denmark is up here, but social democracy, like I've got listed here, is tilting in the direction of more government intervention in this direction, and also a little bit in the direction of more kind of control by government of industry, but not so much. It's not certainly the radical left over here on the left. And so I would say that the majority opinion in the United States, which is what I'm illustrating with this oval here, and by the way, this is all imperfect. This is just a guide. You can make objections to just about anything I put on this graph and the positions I've got it, and so forth. But it's just trying to get the gist of how there are differences in our society and opinion. But the US majority opinion, I would argue, is very much in the middle of this mix. It's not on the radical left. It's not on the radical right. 70% probably of Americans are somewhere close to the center of the spectrum. But I have this tilted just a little bit more in the right direction, because if you actually do the opinion surveys and ask people where they are, it tilts a little bit right in terms of the majority opinion. But again, it's very much in the middle of this mix. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. So let me define a little bit more carefully the US radical left and the US radical right, if you will. So the radical left, I would say, is very antagonistic towards capitalism and profit-seeking in general, and very, very negative towards business. They don't look at business as a good force in the society, but that the business is always trying to screw individuals and make people worse off, and we've got to control them. And that's one of the reasons for public ownership of the means of production being a strong idea on the very radical left side. Very, very conditioned towards altruism is the motivating force, that we should be, much more giving to individuals, that we should be less taking, that self-interest is not a laudable goal, but that we should be more caring and more giving and more charitable. And I think that's a reasonable characteristic of the radical left. Not a bad notion, but that's what they generally believe. And definitely, the more radical left promotes greater government regulation and even state, that's supposed to be an A, even state-owned enterprises potentially, like I was mentioning in Britain in the 1960s and 70s. Now, the radical right, if you will, tends to be antagonistic very much towards almost all government regulation. And, on the very far right, it's sort of like we don't need government at all. We ought to have just about anarchy because government doesn't do anything good in the economy. And that's the very extreme position on the far right. Very focused on self-interest and and individual freedom as the motivating force on the very far right. And I also want to distinguish a little bit on the right between two different forms. You've sort of got the economic right, and then you've got the religious right. And on the religious right, we can say they're promoting what's called conservatism. I just want to highlight the fact that conservatism is a term that could be used anywhere in the world, but it's generally an idea in that whatever society you're in, of reverting back to, quote unquote, the better past. It's kind of like conservatism is, let's go back to the old ways of doing things because things were so much better then. And religious conservatism today sort of has that basic idea. They say, look, the U.S. was created by a group of individuals who are all Christians, and they say the U.S. is a Christian nation, and we need to be promoting Christian values. And that's a very conservative perspective, which is not held by a lot of the classical liberals that we've talked about, like Milton Friedman, for example. Okay, they would say, in fact, I'm not a conservative. I don't believe in going back to that past. I believe we can look forward and go forward. So it's important to kind of recognize that there should be this distinction on the right between kind of the conservatives and the more classical liberals on the right. Okay, so I want to highlight a concept introduced by Francis Fukuyama. If you're taking political science classes, I'm sure you will read some of his stuff. He's a political scientist. And in his book, listed here in this bullet point, in 2011, The Origins of Political Order, the whole book is about how do we arrange a society to get to Denmark. And the term he's using it's a catchy phrase because it's kind of like Denmark has all these great things going for it. You know, it tends to be, or it is very much a social democratic economy. There's a lot of government intervention in the economy. People live well. People live happily. It's an orderly society, and it's a great place to live. And his book is all about kind of societies around the world are all clamoring and trying to figure out how do we make our country more like Denmark. And so that's his position, and you can read that book to learn a lot more about that. But in general, what does that mean? How does one create a stable, peaceful, prosperous, inclusive, and an honest society? That's how do we get to Denmark? Okay, and that's why going back here, I've got Denmark up here in the social democratic camp. How do we get there? All right, now I want to talk about someone on the far right as well, whose name comes up from time to time, quite a bit in fact, and her name is Ayn Rand. She lived from 1905 to 1982. She fled the USSR as an adamant critic of communism and collectivism. You know, she viewed government as essentially theft of individuals. It's taking money away against their will, and it's impinging upon individuals' freedoms to do what they want. And it is very much sort of a strong proponent of the far right, almost radical right, but not conservative right in popular discussion. Okay, she wrote 2 novels, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, which are often lauded by supporters as being great works of literature and often criticized by opponents as being garbage. Ayn Rand is like a political lightning rod to people. She's either loved or she is criticized and hated. And let's just talk a little bit about her points of view. She's held in high regard by many on the U.S. right, and I put a couple of names here: Rand Paul, Mark Cuban, Alan Greenspan, Peter Thiel. Alan Greenspan is the former chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. And if you click on this link, which I'm not going to do for you, it actually takes you to a Wikipedia page, which is a list of lots of prominent people who have said they've been inspired by Ayn Rand. Okay, so she's a phenomenon that you should know something about. Now, she was a staunch promoter of individual self-interest. And here's kind of a critical thing that I think makes her very radical in terms of her beliefs. She believed that altruism is completely incompatible with freedom. with capitalism and with individual rights. She said everybody should be self-interested, they should only care about themselves, and that altruism is an evil, if you will, that we have to stamp out. Now, for most individuals, that's going pretty far, because it's kind of like saying, well, you shouldn't even be charitable to your family or to your friends or to your community. And that doesn't seem right at all. So it's really easy to take some of her statements and just say, well, she's going way too far, and we can't have anything, we don't want to associate with her at all. Now, to be fair, I discovered these two quotes and this couple of bullet points here in putting together this lecture. So this is new to me as well. But she actually is quoted as saying, there's nothing wrong with helping other people. What I'm fighting for or fighting against is the idea that charity is a moral duty and that people are responsible, have to do that, and it's a primary virtue. And so I read this thing that said that she was actually reacting to something at the time, which is some writings of Auguste Comte, and his notion that people should renounce self-interest completely and live only for the sake of others. And she was saying, no, that's ridiculous. An economy, a society is not going to work if people are trying to be only altruistic, because the self-interest motive is just too powerful. And we see that a little bit in the way the functioning of our economy works. We go back to the Smith and Jones model. We think about it's self-interest that's getting Smith and Jones to come together and trade with each other in the marketplace. It is not altruism. Adam Smith said long ago, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner. Okay, and so she's fighting against that particular concept. But she is in part, I would say, part of what kind of gives the far right or the right kind of a bad name, because again, she's very much a lightning rod in the discussion of things. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the self-interest versus altruism controversy. The US political left tends to see, I'm reading this bullet, tends to see the government as providing for more altruistic outcomes, such as universal health care, social and economic equality, and that's a role for government, something that government can achieve. While the US political right tends to see government as preventing individual self-expression or self-interest, and thereby reducing freedom. So the real conflict between the left and the right is whether we're inhibiting freedom in order to generate more altruistic outcomes or not. And that's a little bit of where there's some push and pull between the two different sides.